Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Metro DC EDS and HSD support groups webinar with Dr. Lawrence Afrin, who will be answering questions on MCAS issues. Kendra Nielsen-Wiles of EDS Wellness will be moderating, and I will turn this over to her. Thank you again for coming this evening.
Any particular brands that reliably serve all mast cell patients well. And let's be clear that much the same as I could say for any other drug that has potential for helping in this disease, there are plenty of people who don't respond to quercetin. But for those for whom it does work, great. Dosing typically starts around 250 to 500 milligrams twice a day, and I typically advise my patients that each week, as long as they're tolerating it okay, they can step up the dosing. If you get up to around, you should never push it beyond what you're tolerating, but if you get as high as 1,000 milligrams 3 to 4 times a day and you're just not seeing any significant improvement, then forget it. It's just not going to be the right molecular key for the particular molecular lock that is the individual patient's particular variant of this highly variable disease. So you give it up and you move on. There are other drugs in the same class as quercetin. Quercetin is generally considered to be in the flavonoid class. So there are other drugs, other flavonoids that are reasonable to try and do help some MCAS patients. Drugs like luteolin and rutin and diosmin. But again, I've not figured out any way to reliably predict which of these drugs are going to best help the individual patient. It's just a matter of trying. And you see what happens, and as much as possible, you want to make just one change at a time, because if you're making multiple changes around the same time and the patient gets either better or worse, nobody, not the patient, not the doctor, has any idea which change is actually making it better or worse. It's a real mess to sort it out at that point. Everybody faces emergencies where you don't have any choice. You got to make multiple changes around the same time, but barring any emergency, one change at a time.
Thank you.
Oh, and let me add too, because I know some people, they try some of these products, regardless of whether it's a drug or it's a supplement, and let's be clear, that's just a semantic difference that might make a difference to humans and politicians, but it doesn't make any difference to the mast cells. But I know there are some people who try various drugs for months on end, hoping that someday they'll have a big breakthrough with it. But for the great majority of the drugs it makes sense to try for this disease, it really only takes about a month at most. Some drugs even less time than that to figure out if they're going to be a significant game changer for the individual patient. Again, doesn't apply to every drug. There are a few exceptions, but for most drugs, it's only a month at most. And if you haven't seen significant benefit by that point, forget it. It's not the right drug and you do not want to be keeping a drug in your regimen for the rest of your life when the best that you can tell the doc about your experience with it after a month is maybe a little bit better. Nah, that's not nearly good enough to warrant keeping the drug in your regimen for the rest of your life. You dump it, and you got to be ruthless about it. You move on, you try something else. When a given mast cell patient finds a particular drug that just happens to be one of the right molecular keys for fitting into that patient's molecular lock, they come back in just a month, and it's obvious to both the patient and the doctor. that's going to be a keeper. You got to be realistic in your expectations. It's unlikely that any one keeper is going to significantly improve all the patient's problems, but nevertheless, whatever problems that drug does significantly help, if it's a keeper, it'll be obvious. Everything else you ditch.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And along those same lines, I'm going to ask another question along those same lines, and then I wanted to step back a few steps, and just kind of get an overview of just kind of the MCAS world as we know it, and any updates in terms of research and everything. But first, along those same lines, in terms of the drugs, medications, is there anything out there that can treat MCAS flares in people with sojourns that are really reactive to medications with anticholinergic effects? I'm sure I butchered that. I'm so sorry. Cannot tolerate antihistamines, ketotifen, sodium cromolyn.
Want to try in a Sjogren's patient who can't tolerate any antihistamines, or who doesn't respond to any antihistamines?
Treat out there can treat MCAS flares in people with Sjogren's that are really reactive to medications that are usual, the typical MCAS medications.
This brings up a really important point, because
if you are really that reactive to so many different medication products you're taking, it's almost certain you're actually not reacting to the drugs that you're trying, at least not most of them. And instead, it's much, much, much more likely that your dysfunctional mast cells are being triggered by one or more of what we very generically call the excipients, the fillers, the binders, the dyes, the preservatives, and so forth. It's much more likely to be one or more of the excipients. It's actually triggering that reactivity, not the drugs. So I know it's disappointing anytime anybody, regardless whether they got MCAS or anything else, when you try a new medication product and right out of the starting gate you're having troubles with it. That's disappointing for the time lost, the money, etc. But especially in a mast cell patient, where it's so much more likely to be an excipient issue that's driving those reactions, and given that many excipients are used in a huge number of medication products, those incidents are, unfortunate, but they're also a huge opportunity. And honestly, a mast cell patient should never go squandering these sorts of opportunities that they have to at least potentially identify another one of their triggering excipients. So when you're trying a new product and pretty quickly you start having an adverse reaction, you don't give up on the drug that you're being asked to try. You give up on that particular formulation, but you plus minus the pharmacist and the doctor, you take a close look at the full ingredient list for exactly the product you were taking that was causing the trouble. Be careful. Don't go looking at ingredient lists for other formulations, because it's a different ingredient list for every different formulation. The drug will be the same, but all the rest of the ingredients could be quite different. So you look at the full ingredient list for the product you were taking that was causing you trouble, and you and your care providers, you do the best you can to try to figure out which excipient is likely the troublemaking, triggering excipient. And then you go try another formulation of the same drug, same dose, that just does not, and it doesn't matter whether it's another commercially available formulation or a compounded formulation, but you try another formulation, same drug, same dose, but with a different excipient package, not containing the suspected offending excipients. And if you have a better experience with that product, you just prove that it's not the drug that's the problem, it's the excipient. And let me point out too that if you're having kind of similar adverse reactions to different medication products you've been trying, it's almost certain that the reason those adverse reactions are kind of similar, even though the drugs are different, is that the particular formulations you're trying of those different drugs, those different formulations share some particular offending excipient in common. Some of these excipients are used in thousands of different products. So it's a real opportunity when a mast cell patient starts having an adverse reaction, because if you can figure out another one of your triggers, um, great. I mean, that's step one towards successful management of this ridiculously biologically complex disease. Step one is not to try any particular drug. Step one is to identify your triggers as best you can, do your best to avoid them, because it's kind of hard for any drug to gain good control over the disease as long as the patient keeps exposing themselves to a trigger. Now, if you set aside any considerations of potential excipient triggers, and it really does sound like the question, whoever was asking that question, it really does sound much more likely that it's an excipient-based issue that that person unfortunately is suffering. But if you set aside excipient considerations and ask the question, are there specific mast cell targeted drugs that have been identified as best helping in Sjogren's patients? No. The answer to that is no. And I would be careful too about, unless the diagnosis of Sjogren's is kind of locked in and really rock solid. You've got multiple rheumatologists all agreeing there is no question this is Sjogren's. Like you've got persistently, substantially elevated levels of the antibodies that are known to be associated with Sjogren's disease, and you've gotten a salivary gland biopsy or a lip biopsy that clearly shows abnormalities in the patterns expected in Sjogren's disease. Unless you have that, you need to be a little cautious about accepting a diagnosis of Sjogren's disease. I will tell you that mast cell disease actually can drive a sense of dryness in the eyes, the nose, the sinuses, the mouth, the throat, in a lot of people. But it's not really a dryness that's going, the dryness you see with Sjogren's disease, where an autoimmune attack on the salivary glands and the tear glands are just wiping out all, moisture production. And instead, what many people are thinking is, or the best word they can come up with to describe it is dryness. Actually, it's just inflammation, it's irritation that's coming about from the inflammatory mediators that are being inappropriately released by the dysfunctional mast cells that are in all these different tissues, dominantly the environmental interfaces like the mouth and the eyes and the nose, so forth. So again, if you've got a crystal clear diagnosis of Sjogren's, great, it needs to be treated as Sjogren's classically gets treated. But short of a rock solid diagnosis, just keep in mind there's a possibility that maybe it's not Sjogren's, maybe it's just mast cell disease, and maybe the reason you're having these adverse reactions to so many drugs that ordinarily are well tolerated, maybe the reason is excipient based reactivities. I'll tell you, the vast majority of mast cell patients, they tolerate all the H1 blockers and the H2 blockers out there. They tolerate them at routine doses just fine. That's a different issue than the issue of whether they're going to respond to these drugs. But you can't even assess for how a patient is going to respond to a drug until they're at least tolerating it okay. And at routine doses, the H1 blockers and the H2 blockers are extraordinarily well tolerated drugs. So, especially if a patient is having an adverse reaction to a routine dosing of H1 or H2 blockers, you really got to wonder about excipient reactivities in those patients. All right, I think we beat that horse to death.
That's actually a great answer. And there was a third question that's along those same lines, I think is very much related to that. So I'm going to ask that and then go back to my general update question on the MCAS world. But somebody mentioned, thank you for all your work in helping patients like us. I know in your book you suggest trial and error methods, starting with the cheapest, least risky medication. Are there any common mistakes you tend to see in this approach, either supplements or drugs that aren't tried, or mistakes in trialing and or combining various drugs? I believe that you did touch on that a little bit, but I thought I would ask that as well. Are there any mistakes that you see in this approach that you recommend?
Uh, that's a good question. I think if there are any mistakes I see, it's how do I phrase this? Um, it's patient. It's not just the patients. It's also their local treating doctors who just they haven't yet learned that most people who have this disease really do sooner or later come to identify some combination of mast cell targeted drugs that really, and it's usually a pretty small cocktail that ultimately is the optimal cocktail for the individual patient, but it's a highly unique cocktail for the individual patient. But most people who have this really do sooner or later come to identify some cocktail that does get them doing significantly better than their pre-treatment baseline. The really frustrating part of this is that we are just nowhere close to having the science, the research that's needed to be able to reliably predict which drugs are going to best help the individual patient. We can't even reliably predict which classes of drugs are going to best help the individual patient. And don't go thinking for a moment that just because you happen to have a high histamine level, that it's the antihistamines that are going to be the cat's meow for me, or that I have a high leukotriene E4 level, so it's going to be the leukotriene inhibitors that are going to be the cat's meow. You got to keep in mind when we test for this disease, do the diagnostic mast cell mediator testing. We're only testing 10 out of, or roughly 10 out of more than 1,000 mediators these cells put out. So even if you do find some elevations in that testing, let's be clear that what you're finding is only the tiniest slice of the totality of all the chaos, the mediator, the signaling chaos that's actually going on in the disease. So don't even if you find an elevated, histamine level, don't go necessarily thinking that symptom A or B or C that you're having is necessarily being driven by that by that elevated histamine level, especially if it's just a mild elevation in that mediator you tested, but the symptom you're having is a pretty severe symptom. It's much more likely there's some other mediator that's getting inappropriately released at very high levels. It's actually driving that symptom. But we're very limited in what we can presently test. We do the best we can to at least diagnose the presence of the disease in the patient, and then we have to go trying the different things. So if there's a mistake people make, patients and their doctors make, it's just not having the patience and the persistence to keep trying. Um, I've seen very few patients out of the thousands of mast cell patients I've been able to personally treat over the last 15 years, very few of them who have not been able to find some cocktail that gets them doing significantly better. Um, and let's be clear too that even within any given class of these drugs, there can be remarkable differences in how effective one particular drug can be versus another. I've known patients who, for example, they find the H2 blocker ranitidine to be far more effective for them than famotidine. And I found plenty of patients who found exactly the opposite pattern. I found patients who found, uh, loratadine, and that's in Claritin, and cetirizine, that's in, Zyrtec, and fexofenadine, that's in Allegra. Yeah, they help a little bit, but oh, then they go trying, levocetirizine, that's in Zyzel, and oh my goodness, the difference it makes. I even have seen patients who have tried every H1 blocker that's on the US market, and they don't make much progress, but then they go to the little bit of additional effort. It's really not much additional effort to go accessing the various non-sedating H1 blockers readily available from the Canadian market. You just have your doctor send a prescription to whatever Canadian mail order pharmacy the patient chooses to deal with, and they'll send you a supply. And for some patients, they come to find that the U.S. drugs don't help much, but oh my goodness, that rupatadine or belastine, oh my goodness, what a difference! How can it be? These drugs are not on the U.S. market, and well, because the maker of the drug doesn't want to spend the $1 billion it takes
Go through
to
the USA market.
pass all the FDA requirements to bring a drug to the US market. I mean, heck, it's an antihistamine. It's not like they can charge a whole lot for the drug. So it's hard to make back $1 billion investment when you can't charge much for the drug. But yeah, you can see remarkable differences from one drug to another. So this is why I kind of preach I counsel all my patients that the principles from successfully managing this disease that both the patient and the treating doctor have to abide by are patience, persistence, and a very methodical approach in stepping through the trials of these different drugs one at a time as best you can. Again, there are always emergencies, but as best you can, but you don't have to go along with each trial to figure out whether it's going to be the right key for your lock or not. Um, Other than that, honestly, I can't. There's so little in the way of established research and science to definitively say, oh, in this particular situation, you should definitely, this particular class of drug clearly serves mast cell patients better than this class of drug. There's so little, if any, of that sort of research out there that it's really hard to say there's a right order, a right sequence or a wrong sequence for going through these medication trials. And you certainly can't say that it's more likely that expensive stuff will be more helpful than cheap stuff. And this is why, in general, there are always exceptions, but in general, why not try the cheap stuff? And especially when the antihistamines are as cheap as they are. And most people who have mast cell disease do sooner or later find some H1 blocker and some H2 blocker that really does significantly help them. then why not start with those drugs? I mean, if you can find a better and I do have occasional patients who, honest to gosh, they really do have specific reasons why it kind of makes sense to go starting with other drugs. So fine, in those cases, we start with other drugs. These guidelines we've come up with, like you generally start with antihistamines. They're guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules. Um, but lacking any data, any science to tell you there's a better way to do it, then why not do it this way?
Well, I appreciate your answer to that, and I think that definitely helps us. And again, it's for years, it's always been patience and persistence and consistency. And as much as all of us want something quicker and faster, we just have to have the patience and persistence. Dr. Afrin, do you mind sharing just an update on where we stand in the world of MCAS? And we're going to go back to the questions again, but just let us know, where are we standing right now in terms of research? Or even, you mentioned thousands of mediators and that we only test for a few of them. Is there a new mediator that we're going to be able to test for sooner than later that is looking really good and providing, I don't know, a really good indication for a certain subset of MCAS patients? Where do we stand right now with research and maybe up and coming modalities for therapy?
I wish I could give you some great new news on any of those questions since we last talked, but I can't. First of all, just a minor correction. I think you had mentioned thousands,
Oh yeah,
plural,
right.
of mediators. I don't think anybody's identified that many
A
mediators,
thousand, maybe
but there
hundreds.
have been more than 1,000 that have been identified so far, as demonstrated in the literature. Um, uh, so no, I'm not aware of any new tests that are coming along that we that we expect to become available anytime soon for helping to establish a diagnosis or identify a particular type of MCAS. I mean, we still really have no way of subclassifying MCAS. Um, I fully expect that at some point we'll get there. The research will be done. We'll come to better understand why certain patients behave in the ways they do that are different from other patients. There have got to be molecular reasons and genetic reasons for all this. But I mean, Kendra, we're talking about a time scale in getting this research done. We're talking about a time scale of decades, not months or years. If there's any one area of research that I think everybody is kind of on the edge of their seats waiting to hear about. We've been getting teasers from this research group for, gosh, I think it's more than 2 years now, and it is kind of strange that nothing has emerged yet from that group. We've been hearing from a research group out of my old haunt, the Medical University of South Carolina, that there's a group there that thinks they have identified at least one of the genetic causes of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that is often associated with mast cell activation syndrome. Um, but they have been extremely tight-lipped about what they have found. I haven't heard of any leaks whatsoever. Nobody outside that group has any idea what they have found. And ordinarily, when things just keep going for a long time, where you hear somebody's found something, but you don't even see an abstract come out anywhere, you kind of start wondering whether it's true or not, or whether maybe some holes are being found. I haven't seen that anybody in that group has yet expressed any doubts as to the significance of what they found, and yet I nobody has heard anything about what they found, or even when their papers. I've heard they're targeting for the New England Journal of Medicine, but nobody has heard anything about when that'll actually come out. And let's be careful too that even once it comes out, okay, that's one group, one set of research, but the hallmark, the benchmark of good science is independent reproducibility. So it'll be intriguing if they have found a mutation or a set of mutations that seem to be able to drive hypermobile EDS, but fundamentally, until their findings are confirmed by other independent groups, it'll still just be intriguing.
Yeah.
And nobody should go betting the farm on it.
You've previously mentioned that in terms of I would say the group of people that are under the HEDS, the hypermobile EDS umbrella, and I say umbrella because I'm sure there's many different reasons why and causes of it once we look at the actual mutations and different things that are causing it. And you've mentioned that possibly a subset is probably linked to MCAS. Do you have a best professional estimate of your best guess educated guess that you could make of what portion of that subset might be related to MCAS,
Yeah,
or that you can actually stay online during a recording?
no, I mean we're all just this is kind of an informal
Yeah.
talk. I'm not getting up in front of a scientific society here, and to be crystal clear, I have no data um, on this. I just have my clinical experience, and obviously a pretty biased clinical experience. I've been seeing almost nothing, in terms of my own clinical experience. I've been seeing almost nothing but MCAS patients for about a decade now. And so, you know, anybody who hears me estimate that it's probably a sizable subset of the HEDS population that has some variant of MCAS at the root of it, they can probably forgive me for having that suspicion, because I do see HEDS or some extent of it, kind of whether it formally meets the HEDS criteria or something less than that you might just categorize as a hypermobile spectrum disorder. I see that in a lot of my patients, probably, oh gosh, well more than 50% of my patients. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's 60, 70, 80% of hypermobile EDS that ultimately is found to be due to some form of, one variant of EDS, one variant of MCAS or another. Um, and it much more likely is multiple variants. I mean, HEDS is a heterogeneous disease. MCAS is a heterogeneous disease, so it's probably quite a variety of MCAS variants that are driving different forms of HEDS. But based on what I've been seeing, I suspect it's going to be a high percentage. So one of the questions we're going to have whenever the group in Charleston publishes their findings, I think we're going to ask, well, are these mutations that they found, um, first of all, are these inborn mutations that are really present in every cell in the body, as is the case with all the other forms of HEDS? Um, Or are these mutations, which for the most part, I mean, there are always exceptions, but are these mutations which for the most part are not inborn and instead are acquired mutations, acquired at various stages in the patient's life, perhaps even starting quite early. And if they are acquired, if they're mostly acquired mutations, then they're, by definition, they're not going to be in every cell in the patient's body. They're only going to be in some cells. And then the really interesting question becomes, well, which cells? And do those cells include the mast cells or not? I mean, how much, is it possible that some of the mutational profiles they might discover, maybe in truth, what they're finding are just certain variants of MCAS? Um, maybe. I mean, again, nobody has any idea what this group has found. Nobody outside that group. So we're all speculating.
Right. And I don't believe that there's other research that has been recently published along those same lines or pertaining to the same genetic interest in terms of MCAS or HEDS at this point. I could be wrong, but I'm not necessarily up to date on every single thing like I used to be, but I haven't seen anything. I do pay attention to that. So along those same lines, or talking about different things that are impacted by people with MCAS, could you elaborate a little bit more? We're going down the line. I'm trying to focus on different systems of the body. In terms of those that have menstrual irregularities or menstrual issues, can you talk about the extent of MCAS can impact or trigger severe menstrual problems? And I know we've talked about that several times on different things that we've done with this group, as well as different things you and I have done, Dr. Afrin, but I don't really think this ever gets old. And I think so many of us suffer with this. So,
Oh, absolutely. A lot of women, unfortunately, suffer with this aspect of the disease. Um, and once you come to understand the biology of this a little better, it's not all that surprising because there actually are receptors on the surfaces of the mast cell. In the same way the mast cells output so many different mediators, the mast cell also has many different receptors for many different signals, many different chemical signals in the body. And I think at last count, the number of receptors that have so far been identified on the surfaces of the mast cells is getting pretty close to 300. And among those roughly 300 or so mediators includes receptors for all the major sex hormones, including estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. Now, interestingly, when progesterone and testosterone come to engage with their corresponding receptors on the surface of the mast cell, it actually inhibits mast cell activation. But when estrogen comes to engage with the estrogen receptors on the surface of the mast cell, it further activates the mast cell. And that's just with normal mast cells. You can imagine pretty easily that with dysfunctional mast cells, the amount of activation and the types of activation that you might get from estrogen engaging with those estrogen receptors could be way beyond the activation you get under the normal circumstances with normal mast cells. And certainly at certain points in the menstrual cycle, there certainly are surges in estrogen. And of course, you see a huge surge in estrogen with pregnancy. And this is probably why many women with mast cell disease who get pregnant, they, pretty early into the pregnancy, they start having some substantial worsening of mast cell driven symptoms, many times even entirely new problems emerging that probably are coming from the estrogen hitting on their mast cells so hard. And so, in these women who have all these menstrual issues, whether it's excessive pain, whether it's excessive bleeding, whether it's various neuronal issues like central neuronal issues like mood instability issues, for example, and cognitive issues getting worse during the periods. I'm not going to say it's necessarily exclusively a matter of estrogen hitting on those, heightened levels of estrogen hitting harder on those estrogen receptors on the mast cells. But nobody would be surprised if, as the research develops in the decades to come, that is indeed what is shown to be the case. So, and a lot of this makes even more biological sense. I mean, the bleeding, for example, there's so many women who have MCAS and they just have horrendous problems with, I think, what the gynecologists call dysfunctional or abnormal uterine bleeding, sometimes what's also medically called menorrhagia. Um, and it kind of makes all the sense in the world when it's happening in somebody with MCAS, because first of all, you think about the anatomy of mast cell disease. I mean, where are the mast cells in the body? Well, in truth, they're everywhere, but in most tissues in the body, pretty sparsely distributed. But where the mast cells are dominantly sited is at the environmental interfaces. That absolutely includes the genitourinary tract and the endometrium, the internal lining of the uterus, absolutely is part of the environmental interface in the genital tract, the female genital tract. So the mast cells are dominantly found at the environmental interfaces and in the walls of all vessels and in the sheaths of all neurons. So the endometrium kind of necessarily is a heavily vascularized tissue. Has to be able to provide, a vastly increased blood supply when the woman gets pregnant to support the development of heavily vascularized placenta and support all the blood supply initially to the fetus, which then comes to grow its own blood supply. But the point is that because it's an environmental interface and because it's so heavily vascularized a tissue, even under normal circumstances, you've got a large load of mast cells diffusely throughout the endometrium. And so that's the anatomy lesson. The relevant biology lesson is that one of the 1,000+ mediators that the mast cell produces, and this was actually the very first mast cell mediator ever discovered back in the 1930s, was heparin. Mast cells are warehouses of heparin. And to those in the audience who are not yet familiar with heparin, it's an extremely potent blood thinner, an anticoagulant. Doctors actually use heparin all the time as a drug to thin out the blood of patients who have developed blood clots because we don't want them to develop more blood clots. And if you've ever seen anybody who's getting treated with heparin, you see all the bruises scattered all about them because heparin is such a potent blood thinner. Well, yes, you've got a ton of mast cells in the endometrium, and they've got a ton of heparin. And then, by the way, the mast cell is the only type of cell in the human body that makes any significant amount of heparin. But all that heparin sitting there in the endometrium, in the mast cells, it doesn't make a difference as long as they're normal mast cells dribbling out tiny bits of heparin under controlled circumstances. But when you get a bunch of dysfunctional mast cells that from time to time are just very inappropriately dumping their loads of heparin into that highly vascularized tissue. Who on earth is going to be surprised if you develop, you know, unexpected bleeding, unexpected in terms of timing, unexpected in terms of severity or degree? So the bleeding is no surprise at all. So what do you do about it? Well, in many women with mast cell disease, it's fortunate that kind of standard mast cell targeted drugs like standard oral treatments, antihistamines, and so on and so forth sometimes can do a good job in helping with that. Um, but sometimes you need to try some other approaches, and maybe um, uh, maybe a hormonal approach. No, not a standard oral contraceptive that might contain an estrogen-like drug in it, but rather one of the low dose progesterone only contraceptives, whether oral or IUD, might be wonderfully helpful. And I've got a number of patients like that who have responded very nicely to that approach. In some women, unfortunately, all the hormonal maneuvers in the world just are not enough to gain control over this. And so sometimes um, we actually wind up trying topical treatments like compounded vaginal suppositories of mast cell targeted drugs like a Benadryl or a Cromolyn suppository, for example. And in some women, it can be spectacularly helpful in controlling bleeding and other issues. Let me back up just a moment to the hormonal stuff because I'll mention that more recently, I've been finding occasional patients who actually seem to be responding to other sort of anti-estrogenic pharmacologic approaches. So there are some types of drugs that actually antagonize estrogen. Um, and unsurprisingly, most of them wind up getting used in either the fertility setting or the breast cancer setting, trying to prevent the development or the relapse of breast cancer, which often is an estrogen influenced disease. So there's a class of drugs, for example, called the selective estrogen response modulators, the SERMs, the SERMs, that for all intents and purposes are estrogen receptor blockers. And there are occasional women with mast cell disease whose menstrual issues see nice improvement with one or another of the SERMs. There's also a class of drugs, and to my knowledge, these are really only used, or at least classically only used to prevent the relapse of breast cancer. But these drugs are called the aromatase inhibitors. And for all intents and purposes, that makes them estrogen synthesis inhibitors. So actually ratcheting down on the body's ability to produce estrogen. And there's some women who take those drugs for many years after developing breast cancer. And yes, there are always potential toxicities with any drug, but they're on the market because overall the benefits seem to exceed the risks. And so ratcheting down on the production of estrogen is perhaps, at least in theory, another route, another biologically sensible route by which it one might be able to gain control over excessive menstrual problems in somebody, in a woman with MCAS.
That's
So
That's awesome. I had not heard that before. I'm not sure if anybody else had, and I thank you for sharing those two types of medications. For all that we've talked about over the years, Dr. Afrin, I haven't heard about that myself, and I know I'm one of those women that is incredibly estrogen sensitive in this area as well. So I appreciate that.
and sometimes it just takes very low doses. I had one patient, this was a few years ago, who just had ridiculously severe MCAS, reactive to a million things. And I think she was in her early 40s and already had two kids, but wanted to have another one. And as is commonly the case with women with MCAS, had fertility issues. Um, so she was not able to become pregnant again, but she wanted another kid. And so she went off to the fertility doctor who actually started her or prescribed for her this one particular SERM drug. And and it's actually a very commonly used drug in fertility stimulation. And there are good biological reasons why, in the process of inducing fertility, you want to try to tamp down on estrogen production again, temporarily while you're trying to induce fertility. Um, and she had had so many adverse reactions to so many medication products that she was very leery of trying this new drug, and so she decided to try it very cautiously instead of at the standard dose that the fertility doctor had prescribed for her. And she found when she started this that I think she started at a dose that was maybe like about 20% of what the doctor had actually prescribed. And he had prescribed a daily dosing of it for like a week in a row. And she found that a single dose at only 20% of the standard dose of that drug brought her enormously better control over her mast cell disease for about 3 weeks. Not quite, close to 3 weeks. One dose. And it just, again, it underscores the importance of finding the particular drugs, the particular molecular keys, the particular molecules that happen to be the right keys, the right molecular keys for the particular molecular lock that is the individual mast cell patient's particular variant of this disease. I don't doubt that as the decades go on, the research advances, testing advances, we'll come to understand what obviously have to be real biological reasons why different mast cell patients respond so dramatically, so differently to different drugs. We'll figure it out eventually, but we're nowhere close to it, and you got to have appropriate expectations for how rapidly or not this research is going to get done. It's much more likely going to get done a whole lot more slowly than anybody would prefer, and that's just the reality of the matter.
Well, this topic has certainly brought up a lot of more questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to ask a few of those, if that's okay, Dr. Afrin, since this topic seems to be a big one, and I'm trying to get to a few other questions. Are you still okay on time?
I can take about another 15 minutes, and then we've got to bring this to an end. I mean, we
All
had
right.
said
Well, we
originally we'd
appreciate
stop
your
around
time.
8 o'clock, but
Yeah.
I'll
Well, that's why I wanted to check in. So I appreciate your extended ability, your extended time, and everybody else's patience. And we try to get to as many questions as possible. But as everybody can understand, it's very complicated. And a lot of the questions, just to answer one of them, there's a lot of nuances and important tidbits of information that Dr. Afrin shares that are pertinent to just answering one question. So I appreciate everybody's patience. I appreciate Dr. Afrin staying on longer. So along the same lines with the hormonal issues in MCAS, I'm assuming somebody mentioned perimenopause and menopause, how MCAS can affect those different stages of life.
No, that's a great question, and let me start the answer by noting that at the opposite end of that part of a woman's life, puberty, menarche, when menses start. That is a tremendously physically, physiologically, and psychologically and emotionally stressful time. And we've known for some time now that major stressors um, uh, do have potential to spark um, sustained, often permanent escalations in the baseline level of misbehavior of the dysfunctional mast cells in a mast cell patient's body. So it's very commonly the case that at puberty, we start seeing a whole new range of, I mean, the patient may have had a range of symptoms earlier in childhood, but then puberty comes, and oh boy, the everything kicks up to a whole new level at that point. Well, menopause also is a big stressor on a woman's body, but I gotta tell you, I don't tend to see nearly as much trouble with flarings or even escalations of mast cell disease around menopause as I see with puberty. And my best guess as to why that is, I mean, everybody in the audience is probably already racing ahead of me and imagining this in their heads, but with puberty in a woman, you have emergence of much higher levels of estrogen. And we've already identified that estrogen is a trigger. It can drive activation of mast cells. Whereas menopause, you're seeing a great reduction in the baseline levels of the various sex hormones, including estrogen. And so maybe, I mean, I actually see a number of women with mast cell disease who welcome menopause as a blessing, not so much because the bleeding goes away, but because there, years and years and years of the monthly worsening of mast cell driven symptoms is now over and done with, probably because the monthly surges of estrogen are done with. So I do see occasional women in whom menopause really does seem to have sparked another escalation of the disease. But I got to tell you, in my experience anyway, they're pretty rare.
That's very helpful. Great information. There's been a couple in the interest of time, and I'm trying to get to a couple quicker questions, if that's okay, Dr. Afrin, to be cognizant of your time and the fact that you've given us extended time, and just to get to a couple more questions that are maybe a little bit quicker, if that's okay. These happen to be medication related in terms of the availability and just kind of updates on the thoughts of medication, if that's all right. Can you still hear me? Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
What's the
great.
question?
So question is about chromium sodium being, let me go back to it. Sorry, I just had it up for a second. It was about chromium sodium seeming to be back on back order for unknown length of time. what other medications may be able to help bridge the gap with a major piece of the cocktail missing? I've not heard about that issue. I myself use cromolyn sodium. I'm now taking the generic, which I used to not be able to tolerate personally, but now I'm able to do okay on it. But I hadn't heard this, so I'm very curious.
Actually, cromolyn has undergone a number of supply challenges at the hands of multiple different manufacturers in many different places on the planet at various points in time over the last many years. And there have been different reasons for each of these supply chain shortages. For example, up in Canada, roughly a couple of years ago, there was a massive national shortage of cromolyn, lasted for many months because the principal supplier of cromolyn, principal manufacturer of cromolyn in that company, unfortunately, there developed some contamination issues in the manufacturing pipeline, and it took them quite some time to work out that problem. And unfortunately, cromolyn is off in a pharmacologic category all by itself. It's not like the H1 blockers where you usually can substitute another H1 blocker in place of the one you've been using. It may not work quite as well, but you'll probably still get some effectiveness from an alternative H1 blocker. But there really aren't any other options to go to in the class of drug that cromolyn belongs to. So sometimes when your regular supply um, peters out, at least temporarily, you got to get creative. I mean, some people, when their commercial supplies peter out, they go trying to get it from a compounding pharmacist. Some people, they if they can't get, say, one of the standard ampules containing liquid cromolyn here on the American market, they have their doctor send a prescription for cromolyn for standard commercially available cromolyn tablets or capsules to one Canadian pharmacy or another, or a European pharmacy. I actually do have some mast cell patients, not many, to be fair, but some who are getting some of their mast cell medications from Europe or South Korea or Japan.
Oh my God.
Uh, it's amazing the extents to which some people go to get the drugs they have learned really do make a significant difference for them. Um, and I know that the Mastocytosis Society, or what they're now called the Mast Cell Disease Society. I know they've been terrific advocates with the FDA, trying to bring to the FDA's attention as quickly as possible anytime there seems to be a shortage developing with one or another mast cell targeted drug. And I can say the same thing about the Canadian, the Mastocytosis Society of Canada. They work very closely with the Canadian drug regulatory authorities on those issues. But whether you want to blame it on COVID or a million other problems, we live in a complex world. There are a million things that have to come together to manufacture a modern day pharmaceutical product to the standards, the very high standards we all expect. And it's not all that surprising when something in the chain fails and there are downstream consequences to that. It's just unfortunate with cromolyn. We don't have other choices right now that we can fall back on.
Yeah. Somebody also asked about Xolair, that they've been on Xolair for a while, and has there been any updates on the issue that can arise with long-term use of Xolair? So something similar in terms of a question about a medication, but more on terms
Yeah.
of just long-term use of the medication.
I've actually not seen anybody yet. And again, this is just my own clinical experience. And I'll tell you, there are allergists out there who have allergists, immunologists who have way more experience with Xolair than with omalizumab. That's the drug in Xolair. They have way more experience with the drug than I do. But in my experience, those patients who tolerate the drug well and seem to respond to it well, I haven't seen any significant long-term issues emerge. There are some, in fact, the biggest problem there's actually been with omalizumab is that the drug company that makes it has been playing all sorts of legal tricks to maintain an exclusive patent on the drug well past the point at which everybody had been expecting the patent would expire and other makers could jump into the game and start making much cheaper generic formulations. Current expectations for the expiration of the patent, I've seen estimates ranging anywhere from about 2024, which I kind of doubt, to as late as 2030. But fortunately, in just the last year, I've actually begun hearing of some drugs with mechanisms of action kind of similar to how omalizumab works that are starting to come through the clinical trial pipeline, not here in the US yet, but overseas. And some of those drugs may actually come to market come to the US market within the next couple of years. So alternatives for omalizumab may come soon.
That's great.
I hope.
That's great. Well, here's a question that hopefully probably take us to the end. It's probably something that it pertains to a lot of us at different times during our MCAS journey, at different times when things get worse. So somebody emailed and asked a question of that she struggles with, let's just say if you struggle with fragrances, struggles with strong fragrances, scented laundry, detergent, perfume, cleaning products, but got much worse after COVID for the first time actually recently. This person can't be around it for more than a few minutes. Quickly get a headache, throat closes up, hard time breathing, talking, singing. Is there anything that can be done for patients in this category that have these symptoms to help alleviate these symptoms?
Okay.
Trying to make it more general.
There are two avenues of discussion that question bring up, but before I get there, very quickly, a thought occurred to me. I want to circle back very briefly to the menopause thing, because obviously, if there's one symptom that hits women more than anything else with menopause, it's the hot flashes, the severe, sweats and hot flashes. And it probably is worth noting, in case any woman out there, whether they've got MCAS or not, and they're suffering this issue, there actually is a new drug that came to market just a few months ago. A new class of drugs, the so-called neurokinin 3 receptor antagonists. And there is a drug, it's got a virtually unpronounceable generic name, probably by design. It has a brand name, oh God, Veoza, I think. But it's the first neurokinin 3 receptor antagonist, and it actually seems to be fairly effective. Now, here's the curious thing. We know there are neurokinin 3 receptors on the surfaces of the mast cells, but what's not been figured out yet, with all the research that had to be done to bring this new drug to the US market to get FDA approval, nobody really knows which types of cells in the human body um, this drug is principally acting against in order to bring about the reduction in hot flashes. So, is it possible that many of the patients who the drug was tested on, who are having all these bad hot flashes, is it possible they were suffering an MCAS driven a menopause-driven escalation of MCAS that happened to result in bad problems with hot flashes, and that the drug is actually calming down those hot flashes by engaging with the NK3 receptors on principally on the mast cells more so than any other type of cell in the body. Nobody knows. But anyway, that is a new drug available for that menopausal issue, and just nobody knows yet whether it actually happens to have any relationship to mast cell disease or not. Now, regarding the fragrance thing, the first thing to mention is that there are a lot of fragranced products. That actually include various, for sure, there are various petrochemical derivatives that create all sorts of fragrances that we enjoy. And we've known for a long time that petrochemical derivatives can be potent triggers of mast cell activation. So, yeah, maybe that's what you're smelling that's been worsening your mast cell disease. But there's also a whole different class of molecules called the salicylates that are found in a lot of fragranced products, particularly the mint smelling products. But you also find these salicylates in a lot of cleaning agents, so household cleaners, detergents, soaps, personal hygiene products, soaps, shampoos, sometimes even toothpastes. And there actually is a subpopulation of mast cell patients who absolutely are triggered by even tiny amounts of salicylate exposure. So, if you go looking at the overall pattern of your reactivities, and I mean, there is information out there on the internet about salicylate reactivity and mast cell disease. And if uh, look at one of these resources and you say, oh, yeah, there's no question about it. I am reacting to everything that's got a high salicylate content, and I generally don't react to the things with low salicylate content, both the foods and the household products. Then you may be one of these salicylate reactors, and maybe that's the issue going on with at least with some of these reactions. With regard to COVID having made the reactivity worse, look, there's no question that both COVID infection, the actual virus, and the vaccines, which completely understandably have a lot of molecular similarity to the molecular structure of the virus itself. That's what you have to do so that the vaccine can induce an antibody response that'll help protect you against actual infection by the virus. So there's no question that the virus and the vaccines have potential to engage, to interact with the mast cells. Now, by and large, you don't have to worry about what either what the virus or the vaccine does in its engagement with normal mast cells. Normal mast cells will respond normally. There will be some increase in activation, a controlled increase for a modest amount of time, and then things settle down. The problem, unfortunately, is that there seems to be something about the molecular structure of the COVID virus and the vaccines, and nobody has really figured out what exactly this is yet. But there's something about the structure of this particular virus and the related vaccines that seems to be able to drive maybe not all types of dysfunctional mast cells, but nevertheless, many types of dysfunctional mast cells to wildly overreact, to overactivate. And it's the exposures of these, of the virus and the vaccines to these dysfunctional mast cells that is driving not only a ridiculously severe acute course of COVID infection and a ridiculously severe reactivity, acute reactivity to vaccination. But then, because it's such a major stress on the body to have that severe acute stress, that's a sort of acute stressor, the major stressor that then drives one of these escalations of the disease that some people come to call long COVID syndrome, which in many people actually is just an escalation of pre-existing MCAS, even though in most of those situations they weren't even recognized previously to have MCAS. Um, so if you already had MCAS and you had to happen to have a variety of MCAS that was reacting to these fragrances, whether it was the petrochemical molecules or the salicylate molecules or both, and then you got an infection that made your dysfunctional mast, you got either infection or vaccination that made the dysfunctional mast cells start misbehaving at a fundamentally worsened baseline, a fundamentally more sensitive baseline, then nobody's going to be surprised if you start having more reactivity. Now, that's not to necessarily say you can't get control over it. There are a lot of things that have been found helpful in various mast cell patients, and it takes patience, persistence, and method to step through it all to figure out what's going to work best for the individual patient. But hey, step one is to identify your triggers as best you can, do your best to avoid them. And if you figure out that it's the salicylates that are a trigger, then do your best to avoid them. I mean, I have some patients who they come to me with all these reactivities, and they also tell me that they're beauty product junkies, and they've got just boxes and boxes and boxes full of various beauty products. And then you look at the ingredient list for these products, and it's salicylates, and it gets a little complicated to figure that out, because don't go thinking that the word salicylate is what's actually going to show up on the ingredient list for all these products, because it turns out that salicylate is actually described on ingredient lists under a lot of other different terms too. So you have to read the information about salicylate reactivity out on the internet to learn about all these alternative terms. But then you realize, oh my God, you've just been bathing yourself in salicylates all this time. I had one patient who finally figured this out and wanted to eliminate all the salicylates in her apartment. And simply in gathering all of these cosmetics together in a box, the odor was so she passed out just from the odor. She had to get a friend to come in and finish cleaning out her condo from all the beauty products in there.
They don't talk about that on the YouTubers that are beauty junkies, Dr. Afrin. We need to talk about that's not what the YouTubers talk about when they are talking about a product.
Well, listen, well, you gotta be careful about what about what medical information you get off the internet, especially when it's from a source that may not have the best medical qualifications.
I think
What's
I
the
have a
old
sink
Latin
full of
saying?
stuff I could probably
Caveat
gather.
emptor, buyer beware, you know?
Well, I think a lot of us can also relate to the beauty junkie problem too. Although I swear, I don't know that mine, the fragrance free is clearly not enough, Dr. Afrin. All right, well, it's 8:37. I appreciate your time and going over almost 40 minutes. So I hope to have you again, if you wouldn't mind, maybe not in 2 years, or maybe sooner than 2 years. I know so many of us appreciate your candor, your willingness to answer questions just very honestly and openly, according to the topic and the category. And we appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
Happy to help. And for the record, the 2 years is not my doing.
That's right.
It's
I
your
take
doing.
full ownership. I take full ownership. So we'll definitely try to do this again sooner than later. Thank you, Dr. Afrin. As always, I love working with you. I always have. And we always just really appreciate your time and willingness to come and share and share your experience with all of us. So thank you.
My pleasure. Have a good
All
evening.
right. Thank you.
Bye.
Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.